In the late 1980s, deep inside Apple, a team of engineers tried to build a Macintosh almost no one outside the company would ever see. It was big, modular, and built not for the living room or the design studio, but for the machine room down the hall. Its code name was Columbo. On paper, it was everything the original Macintosh was not: expandable, serviceable, and powerful enough to act as the center of a networked office. At its heart, according to people who worked around the project, was an audacious idea for Apple at the time: a dual-processor 68030 Macintosh server. Columbo never shipped. It never even got a proper product name. But tracing its story opens a window into a very different path Apple might have taken, one where the company leaned harder into high-end servers and enterprise computing years before the Power Mac or Xserve ever existed. This is the story of Project Columbo, the modular Macintosh server that almost was, and what its quiet cancellation reveals about Apple's internal battles and shifting ambitions. To understand why Columbo existed at all, you have to go back to Apple in the mid-1980s. The original Macintosh, launched in 1984, was famously closed and constrained. It had no slots, limited RAM, a single floppy drive, and an operating system designed around one user, one screen, one task at a time. That simplicity was a deliberate reaction against the complex, expandable Apple II and the business-oriented Lisa. Inside the company, though, that philosophy immediately ran into resistance. Many engineers and some executives saw the Mac not just as an appliance, but as the foundation of a broader platform. They wanted Macs that could sit in corporate offices, labs, and universities, talking over networks, sharing files and printers, and eventually handling serious back-end work. By the mid to late 1980s, this tension was visible in Apple's product line. On one hand, there was the compact Mac, still relatively closed and consumer-focused. On the other, new machines like the Macintosh introduced expansion slots, color graphics, and more memory, concessions to the professional and business markets. Columbo would emerge from this tug-of-war over what the Macintosh was really supposed to become. While Apple argued with itself about the soul of the Macintosh, the rest of the computing world was becoming rapidly more networked. Local area networks were spreading through offices and campuses. Novell NetWare was taking over PC file and print sharing. Unix workstations from Sun, DEC, HP, and Apollo were starting to act as both high-end desktops and departmental servers. The buzzword of the era was client-server computing. Apple wasn't blind to this. The company developed AppleTalk, a relatively easy-to-use networking system, and AppleShare, which turned a Mac into a simple file server for a small work group. Macs appeared on university networks and in design studios, where sharing resources mattered. But these early attempts exposed a gap. An ordinary Macintosh could serve files, but it wasn't designed to be a dependable, always-on server. Storage was limited, reliability under heavy load wasn't great, and the hardware lacked the redundancy and expandability IT departments expected from Unix and mini-computer vendors. Inside Apple, some engineers and product planners concluded that if the Macintosh was going to play in the emerging networked world, it needed a purpose-built high-end machine, a Mac designed from the start as a server, not just a desktop pressed into service. That's where Columbo comes in. Columbo was conceived as a serious modular Macintosh server built around Motorola's 68030 processor, the same family that powered high-end Macs like the Macintosh DSX and DEX, but used here in a much more ambitious configuration. According to accounts from people familiar with the project, the hardware architects targeted a dual 68030 design, two CPUs sharing the workload, with a system architecture built to scale beyond what a single-processor Mac II class machine could handle. This was not a minor speed bump. It was an attempt to push the Macintosh architecture into small server territory. The chassis itself was reportedly much more like a mini-computer or Unix box than a compact Mac. A larger case, easier physical access, and a true backplane or high-bandwidth bus with multiple expansion slots. The goal was to allow third-party cards, high-capacity storage, and advanced networking boards, all serviceable without the contortions required by most desktop Macs of the era. In short, Columbo aimed to be both more powerful and more flexible than the Macintosh 2 and its successors. A machine that could sit in a rack or on a shelf and quietly run a company's file, print, and possibly database services while still speaking the Macintosh's graphical and networking languages. The engineering problem was that Apple was trying to bolt this ambitious hardware onto an operating system that had never been designed for it. The classic Mac OS of the 1980s was fundamentally single-tasking at its core. Even as Apple layered on features like Multi-Finder to allow limited multitasking, the system remained cooperative. Applications had to voluntarily yield control. Much of the OS code was not reentrant, meaning it couldn't safely be executed by two processors at the same time. Bringing up a dual 68030 system in this environment wasn't as simple as wiring two CPUs to the same memory bus. Every assumption in the toolbox, drivers, and low-level system software revolved around a single processor, one event queue, and a very particular timing model inherited from the 128K Mac. Vendors in the Unix world could rely on operating systems with process schedulers, memory protection, and a clear story from multiple CPUs. Apple's engineers, by contrast, were facing the prospect of either radically re-architecting the Mac OS internals for Columbo or constraining the second processor to a narrow range of tasks that wouldn't collide with the fragile system. By most accounts, this mismatch between bold hardware and aging software architecture became one of the central technical challenges of Columbo, and a warning sign for managers watching schedules and budgets. Technical hurdles were only part of Columbo's struggle. The other part was Apple itself. The late 1980s and early 1990s were a famously chaotic period for Apple's product planning. Different groups pushed their own visions. Some wanted Apple to double down on consumer and education markets, others argued for high-end graphics workstations, and still others believed the future lay in servers and enterprise networking. Columbo sat squarely in the last camp. That put it in competition, at least politically, with other high-end Macintosh projects that promised revenue sooner with less architectural risk. New Macintosh 2 variants, later Quadra models, and various workgroup-oriented add-ons all vied for engineering talent and marketing attention. According to some recollections, Columbo didn't have a single powerful executive champion in the way that later, more visible projects did. Without that sponsorship, a complex, expensive server project was easier to question every time budgets were reviewed. Meanwhile, other internal initiatives, some related to advanced networking, others touching on future operating systems, were evolving in parallel. Columbo risked becoming an orphan, too different for the mainstream Mac group, too tied to the traditional Mac OS to align neatly with Apple's more radical long-term software experiments. The precise decision points that killed Columbo are not as well documented as the existence of the project itself, but the broad outline is reasonably clear. Cost was almost certainly a factor. A dual-processor 68030 system with a custom backplane, server-grade storage, and robust power and cooling would have been expensive to build. Priced high enough to cover its bill of materials, it would have landed in the territory of established Unix workstations and mini-computers from companies that already had strong enterprise reputations. Timeline and complexity played a role as well. Building the hardware was challenging but tractable. Reconciling it with the single-user, cooperative Mac OS was something else. By the time engineers and managers fully appreciated the scale of the OS work required to do multiprocessing properly, the project's schedule reportedly looked increasingly optimistic. There were also shifting corporate priorities. As the 1990s approached, Apple was preparing for the transition to the 6840, experimenting with Unix-based systems, and exploring partnerships that might give it a server story without reinventing so much in-house. In that context, Columbo began to look like a risky way to chase a market Apple was not sure how to serve. Some accounts suggest that elements of Columbo's hardware thinking were folded into other, less ambitious server and workgroup products, while the dual-processor vision was quietly dropped. What's clear is that Columbo never emerged as a shipping product, and Apple never marketed a dual 68030 Macintosh server. Even though Columbo itself disappeared, its ghost lingered in the products that followed. In the early 1990s, Apple introduced the Macintosh Workgroup server line, essentially souped-up versions of existing desktop Macs, sold with larger hard drives, server software bundles, and sometimes modest hardware tweaks. These machines were more conventional than Columbo had aimed to be. They adapted consumer-oriented Macs to server roles rather than starting from a clean-sheet server design. Later, in the PowerPC era, Apple finally shipped true multi-processing Macs. Dual-processor Power Mac G4 and G5 systems appeared, this time backed by operating systems. First classic Mac OS with limited support, and eventually Mac OS X, with a far more modern architecture for multitasking and threading. By then, the idea of multiple CPUs in one Apple machine was no longer exotic. Apple's server ambitions flickered on and off through these years. Products like the Apple Network server in the mid-1990s, and much later the Xserve racks and Mac Mini server configurations, show a company repeatedly drawn to, and then retreating from, the dedicated server market. Seen in this light, Columbo looks less like an odd one-off, and more like an early expression of a recurring tension. How far should Apple go in building machines that live in closets and data centers rather than on people's desks? Project Columbo is one of many ambitious Apple efforts that never reached customers. Its story is fragmentary, reconstructed from internal memories, scattered references, and the broader context of Apple's hardware and software evolution. Yet, even in outline, it tells us something important about Apple's culture in that era. This was a company with no shortage of bold ideas, but with a chronic struggle to focus. Multiple overlapping projects, shifting strategies, and hesitance about the enterprise market created an environment where a technically daring server like Columbo could be greenlit, developed, and then quietly set aside. It also reminds us that products which never shipped can still leave marks. The difficulties Columbo exposed, the limits of the classic Mac OS, the risks of chasing enterprise hardware without matching software, the political cost of backing niche markets, would surface again in later debates over servers, workstations, and professional-grade Macs. Documenting these ghost products matters because they map the roads not taken. They show us how different Apple might have been if a dual-processor 68030 Macintosh server had appeared in catalogs alongside compact Macs and colorful marketing brochures. And they help explain why, when Apple finally did return to high-end multiprocessing and servers decades later, it did so with a much clearer sense of which battles it was willing to fight, and which it would rather leave to history.